Okay, having done part A of the assignment, you have a better idea of the possibilities and complexities of doing observational research. In part B of the assignment, you will be reflecting on the experience you had in the first part of the assignment, and you will have some excellent literature to inform those reflections further. So let's have a quick look at some of its main points. And before you watch the video, please grab a piece of paper and a pen for an activity within the video. So here we go. You might want to stop and start if you wish. And excuse my voice, I have some kind of a cold going on. Not COVID, thank goodness, but some kind of a cold going on. So I apologize. All right. Baker points out the following about observation as a research strategy. First of all, observation is a very old strategy that has been used for generations, particularly in methodologies like ethnography. An essential characteristic of observational research is that it takes place in the participant's natural environment. Students in their classrooms or on the playground, for example, parents at a parents' council, administrators in their office, at meetings in various locations, and their work around the school, and perhaps even in the community. And we could go on. In other words, knowledge is not gained by placing participants in a highly restricted and mediated environment like a lab, but rather in the participant's natural context. The researcher's work also takes place along a continuum between observer and participant. And what we mean by that is that the observer or the participant, or some combination, will have precedence in terms of what's happening at that moment in data gathering. So it could be the observer is taking the primary place as a participant observer. They're actually participating and then writing down their observations based on that experience of being right in the middle of things. Or it could be the participant is the primary focus. For example, a observational researcher sits at the back of the classroom and observes a particular group of students, but does not interact with those students at all. So the participants become the focus. Or, and very often, there's interaction and a kind of symbiosis between the observer and the participant. And this, and of course, this positioning may change over time as the research moves forward. So the researcher's role is not static, but is rather fluid and will change depending on what is required to more fully understand the insiders. Now, the insiders are the participants whose insider knowledge is essential to a more complete and complex understanding of the issue being explored in its natural setting. Indeed, as the researcher reflects on their observations, questions may arise for which other methods are necessary for deeper understanding. So, for example, in addition to observation, a researcher may choose to include interviews, storytelling, arts-based inquiry, narrative inquiry, and/or other research approaches to enhance findings revealed by observations. And conversely, observations could be added to any of those primary ways of gathering data as well. One of the first things the observational researcher may be interested in are recurring patterns of behavior, interactions, or relationships. As you think back on your own observations, for example, you may have looked for these patterns as an organizer for your findings in the part A of this assignment. So let's do a little experiment. I'm going to share a short clip of a downtown scene in a section of Tokyo. I want you to think about any recurring patterns you may observe, and then you can write them down as you observe them. And if we had a chance, face to face, we could share that. But I'll talk about my impressions afterwards and see how they line up with yours. So how do we make meaning of such an overwhelming crowd scene? And it's a difficult one, and it would depend on the question that we're asking in our research and so on. But how might we make meaning of all that we observe? For example, it seemed to me that, and I'd have to watch it several times again to be sure, but most of the people that were walking on the sidewalk seemed to be more directive in terms of where they were going, and others seemed to be, the people on the road seemed to be just kind of wandering and sightseeing. I don't know how legitimate that observation would be, and I'd have to do some more work to legitimate that finding, but still, in some ways, it seemed to me that that's what was going on. We could talk about, for example, differences in clothing, the age groups, and how they reacted to the area that they were in. These would be some ways that we could make the amount of information that we were observing more manageable. As Marshall and the other authors that she works with observe, no one can record and analyze everything encountered when conducting a study, and you may have had the same kind of feeling, perhaps on a smaller scale, depending on where you were, when you were gathering your data for your observation as well. There's just so much. So making choices about what to observe and how to observe means privileging some aspects of social life while bracketing others. That's just what has to happen, because it's not possible to do it otherwise, nor would it be meaningful to do it any other way. But what might making those choices mean for our findings? And this is where it gets a little tricky. One thing it may mean is that the researchers need to be self-reflective so they are aware of their own prejudgments and ideological preferences. For example, why are some activities chosen and others ignored? Why would I look at sidewalk people and road people and ignore, for example, youth groupings or the kinds of stores that there were along the way, that sort of thing? Do we pay more attention to the familiar, or do we pay more attention to the outlier, things that we're not familiar with? What effect does that have on our data set and findings? Self-awareness and self-reflection are necessary both in the design and analysis of findings, or research will simply replicate the researcher's worldview and status quo, often to the detriment of the disadvantaged and oppressed. And this is when we have to be particularly self-reflective, because if we're always reflecting a particular experience of the world and never reflect other kinds of experiences of the world, we have a very narrow understanding of what it is of what the environment is that we find ourselves in. So these are some of the more complex questions that come out of observation. Certainly making a decision about what data to gather and how when doing observational research is a challenge, but Marshall et al. See this as a necessary challenge and an important step in the process of observational research. They refer to the early stage of observational research as the discovery stage. We're looking for general impressions. We're, to use their expression, hanging out, but purposefully in order to discover broad areas of interest, maybe some outlier events, similarities or patterns of behavior as well as differences. So we may simply observe for a while until patterns start to emerge in our view. The next step is refinement of our observations based on our findings in the discovery stage. At this point, we are working toward clearer goals for our observations. Once we have clearer goals, we can develop more efficient data collection strategies such as checklists, or we may record key behaviors, contexts, etc. electronically. We can also start developing field notes that enable us to add details such as relevant context details. It might be the weather, it might be traffic patterns, it might be a historical event that's just happened, and so on. Particular activities that are relevant to the behaviors, and so on. At this point, we may also be developing some related questions that require exploration through additional methods such as interviews, document searches, and so on. And conversely, if we're doing those kinds of research, we may include observation as one of the data sets as well. Researchers must always be aware of the logistical and particularly the ethical effects of their actions. As the authors point out, the ethical issues in observational research may become complex. Once the researcher feels that they have collected a rich body of data in relation to their research question, and they are ready to organize and analyze their data, doing so may raise some significant ethical dilemmas that the researcher needs to be prepared for. Baker, in one of her statements, reminds us that practices of strategic deceit, the tactical use of withholding information, a researcher may not tell a participant everything, for example, and making a conscious decision about who will read about the study's findings can follow the participant observer in the community long after an outsider has moved on to other research projects. These are the risks that should be negotiated and carefully calculated by the insider participant observer before the study begins. So we need to be really careful about how we're setting up these research projects, particularly when we have a lot of interaction between participant and observer, because things may be triggered and then the observer moves on, but the participant is left with that trigger, for example, particularly when there's deceit involved. And there are some research projects where you couldn't make findings unless you were somewhat deceitful in terms of what you actually share with the participant and so on. The other aspect is what is revealed in the observations. So what if in your observing, and this is not that usual, but it can happen, you observe dangerous or illegal activities and they're revealed to you, what do you do then? And this is, if you think that this is somewhere where this might happen, and of course Baker would have been sensitive to this, for example, in her work with sex workers, then you need to have thought through carefully your ethical positioning and how it is that you are going to respond to those kinds of challenges. Or what if you find out unflattering information or someone shares unflattering information about another? So a teacher says something unflattering about one of the other teachers in their group or the principal or one of the parents, that sort of thing. What do you do with that information? Do you just discard it? If it's important to your analysis, how do you include it, and so on? So these are some of the questions that can get a little messy when you're dealing with people. It's just the nature of the game. The other piece the other piece that can sometimes be a difficult one is, what do you do when you leave participants at the end of data collection? That can be complex, particularly if you've been in a location for a long time, or if you've had a lot of very kind of personal interaction with the participants. You can't just kind of love them and leave them, and researchers do, and that can leave some pretty bad taste in people's mouths about what has happened and what they've shared and that sort of thing. So that needs to be negotiated perhaps right at the beginning, so there's a clear understanding of how the research project is going to move forward and what's going to happen at the end and what's going to work for participants and what's not. Analysis may compromise relationships built when collecting the data. So you collect your data, you find some things that are replicated in various aspects of your research, and it becomes an important theme that you really feel needs to be pursued. But it's not particularly supportive, perhaps, of people that participated, or it critiques them in a way that might feel a bit hurtful. So, what do we do with that kind of information? And what about a quid pro quo? That is, for example, in Indigenous settings, for generations, we've had researchers going in, finding out things that would be helpful to them, and then walking away, benefiting from that knowledge, but never doing anything to benefit that Indigenous community, for example. So what are our ethical responsibilities there? So these are some of the kind of complex people situated questions that become part of all of this and are very important to have thought through. So observational research has the potential to build understanding in very deep ways, even transformative ways, but its deeply human engagement can be ethically challenging, as we've just discussed. A researcher needs to be thoughtful and aware of the potential ethical issues that may emerge before they do, so that a researcher is more likely to respond to the ethical challenge in a wise and ethical way. So I hope this video and your readings will be helpful as you reflect on your observations in part 1 of the assignment in Module 1. And I'm really looking forward to reading your reflections on that whole activity that you just engaged in, and how you draw from the readings that may enhance your reflection. Just to note that the observation assignment in its entirety replaces the forum in Module 1. So we will begin regular forum discussions in Module 2. So there's only this assignment in Module 1. And as always, if you have any questions, I'll look forward to chatting about them with you at any time. So please let me know if you have any questions at all. So all the best of luck as you do your readings and reflect on your findings in your observation assignment. And I'll be responding to you soon when I get those assignments. Take care.